Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 14th week in our course on drugs and behavior. So this week we'll talk about opioids. And this is actually the last week where we'll spend the entire week on one topic. From here on, we'll actually move into some smaller topics and wrap up the course. So we're really looking at opioids, which are a particular class of drugs, and they're actually fairly specific and consistent in terms of the effects they produce, as well as their mechanism of action, what they do to the brain. So we'll talk about the history of opioids. Opium and the opiates, we'll get into the differences in those terms in a minute, occur naturally. And as with our other naturally occurring drugs, they have a long history. They've been known for thousands of years. The synthetic versions are obviously more recent, and so we'll talk about all of these. We'll also talk about what opioids do to the brain and to behavior in the body. And we'll also talk about how people use opioids, both legally and illegally, what regulations are in place. And so for this session in particular, we'll be focusing on the history. So first we'll learn what is meant by the term opium, and what is meant by the term opiate and opioid. Those are all different things. So we'll look at the early history of opioids. Again, as a naturally occurring substance, it has a longer history than some of the synthetic substances we've talked about already. And then we'll look at where opioids fit in globally, why they're important. And it turns out that different parts of the world produce and consume opioid products, and so there is an international importance in terms of what opioids are used for and how they're moved around the world. So we'll talk about all of that. So first, because I had to record last week's lectures early, I didn't get a chance to touch on the discussion questions covering hallucinogens, and so I'll do that now. So the first question was about hallucinogens and what we call palliative care, which is usually end-of-life care, especially for older adults, but those with terminal diseases, there's some evidence that this can bring some relief. Obviously, analgesia, that is, reducing pain, is not the primary effect of hallucinogens. It's not the most famous. It's certainly not the one they're known for. But there are other effects of hallucinogens that may be beneficial. And so the question is, should those be used in palliative end-of-life care? The consensus was largely yes. Some of it was a qualified yes. So as long as there were controlled dosages. So obviously hallucinogens are usually used recreationally. There aren't that many medicinal uses for them. And they're often also naturally occurring, which means that most hallucinogen users are not very careful about the dosages. But here in a palliative setting, this could be something administered by a doctor, and so we could be more careful about those dosages, and in fact learn more in a research setting about what certain dosages do. That's the next question, is about hallucinogens and research. And of course, as always, any legitimate medical use can have an illegitimate one. So there were concerns over a rise in the general availability of hallucinogens. Anytime you start prescribing a drug, even for a legitimate use by a person, what if the person doesn't use all their prescription? What do you do? What happens to the leftover drugs? And this is true for many prescription medications, not just hallucinogens. What happens to those leftover drugs? Some of that drug supply will kind of bleed off into recreational use. And again, this is true for opioids, we'll talk about this week. It's true for over-the-counter drugs. And there's also the danger of overprescribing. That is, if someone requests a prescription, there's variance in the medical community as to how readily a doctor will prescribe a drug. And that's not to say that doctors that prescribe drugs a little more easily are dishonest in some way, or that they're making extra money off of this. That's just a hard question to answer. At what point do you let the patient decide when they need a drug or not? At what point do you decide they need the drug? So there's some controversy over that. There's some gray area in terms of how easily a doctor should prescribe a drug. You don't want to prescribe someone a drug that they don't need, but you also don't want to deny a drug to someone that legitimately needs it. So it's a very hard decision. The other discussion question was about the consequences of research on hallucinogens. As we discussed during our lectures on hallucinogens, uh, they're not as heavily researched as some of the other classes of drugs that we've talked about. And some are in favor of more research on hallucinogens. Others are worried that by researching hallucinogens, we will in some sense legitimize their use, and then more people will use them with possibly negative side effects. So the first question, of course, is how tight that connection is between research and recreational use. And that's hard to say because for most drugs, more research has increased over time, and so it's hard to connect those two phenomena, whether research in a scientific community is connected to increase the perception of, of approval for drug use. So that's sort of a sociological question. It's very hard to answer that sort of thing, especially because research is a large social phenomenon. It's hard to do a controlled experiment um, and ascertain whether the perception of approval, of legitimacy for recreational drug use is really connected to research. Of course, there are concerns over the safety of hallucinogens. So if it does increase recreational use of hallucinogens, how safe is that? And of course, some hallucinogens are safer than others. As mentioned before, there's never been a overdose in humans on LSD, a lethal overdose. So that's a relatively safe one, but not all of them are so safe. So that's a legitimate concern, and if research does demonstrate a benefit to the use of hallucinogens, uh, we always have to weigh the risks and the benefits. So most drugs have negative consequences, certainly if used in large quantities, but they also have benefits. And so we have to weigh those two, and that's something research can tell us. And then finally, of course, it's not always the case that research on a particular drug, that it's not necessarily the case that all the benefits are therapeutic. Many of the gains in knowledge are in the domain of what we call basic science. So by doing research on agents that increase serotonin levels, for example, we not only discover possible antidepressants, but we also learn more about how the nervous system works, how the brain works. So if there's a particular hallucinogen that acts on a very specific type of receptor, that can be very informative for reasons that have nothing to do with the psychological experience or the possible therapeutic uses of that hallucinogen. It may be very beneficial for our knowledge in general, but not diagnostically or therapeutically. So whenever we're talking about research, we have to keep in mind that not all research is designed with a particular application or particular clinical use in mind. So always something to bear in mind when we're talking about science. Okay, so moving on to opioids. First, let's clear up some of that terminology. So there's opium, which is a resinous substance that comes from the seed pod of the opium poppy. So before it flowers, Papaver somniferum has a seed pod that you can see here on the right. This is a figure from your book. And the way it's harvested is the outside of the seed pod is stored, that is sliced a little bit, it's not cut off. And then after a little while, some of the liquid that comes out of that seed pod will come out of the seed pod and dry on the outside. And it turns into this sort of brown resin. And so that is collected as sort of a gummy substance. And so that is collected and put together, and that is opium. That is raw opium. So this is a natural product. It's been in use for thousands of years. So opium has one of the longest histories of any drug. This was discovered fairly early on. Quite how, who knows? It's not the most obvious place to go in search of a drug. But moving on from opium, so opium is a combination of compounds that is taken directly from the opium poppy. There are the opiates, and these are the psychoactive components of opium. Opium has lots of components to it, but only a handful are psychoactive. And so those are the opiates. So these are naturally occurring, again, we're not into the synthetic ones yet. So these occur naturally in the opium poppy, but it doesn't have, opium is the mixture of everything that comes out of there. Opiates are particularly those psychoactive compounds. And these are morphine, codeine, and thebaine. We'll talk more about morphine and codeine than thebaine. Thebaine has some interesting properties we'll get to later. And then there are the opioids. And so the opioids is actually the broadest category. It includes the opiates, but it also includes the synthetic derivatives of the opiates. And so, for example, heroin is a chemical modification of morphine. You put a couple of acetyl groups on it, and now it's diacetylmorphine, which is branded as heroin. Uh, and so there are lots of these compounds. There are many of them that they vary in their potency and the time it takes for them to take effect. Uh, but all together, collectively, these are known as the opioids. Um, and it's not just now synthetic derivatives. Now there are what are considered to be opioids that aren't derived from the opiates and aren't even chemically all that similar, but they have opiate-like effects, and so they're often included in the opioid group. Okay, so a brief history, early history of opioids, and really of opiates. The early history is going to include opiates. Opioids weren't developed till the 1800s. So the opium poppy originated in the Middle East, and so that is where the opiates come from originally. As we'll see, they're now grown in multiple locations, and so opium is grown all over the world, but it originated in the Middle East and has been used medicinally for at least 3,500 years, possibly longer. Now, as we'll see also next time, opiates and opioids carry with them an unusually high incidence of dependence, and it's thought that perhaps the first evidence of this was recorded around 1000 AD, so 1,000 years ago. And this is interesting because so many of the drugs that we've already talked about, dependence wasn't really recognized as a phenomenon until much later, certainly for things like tobacco. Tobacco dependence wasn't recognized until a couple hundred years ago, if that. So this is unusual, and it also demonstrates how strong opioid dependence is in terms of its effects. If it was that noticeable that long ago, it must be a fairly serious case of dependence. Also, around this time was developed the what's called laudanum, which is just a mixture of opium and usually alcohol, sometimes some other psychoactive compounds. It's sort of the original patent medicine. But this is something that was around until the early 1900s as the patent medicine and was used for pain relief. And of course, like all patent medicines, the effects of laudanum were overpromised, and the negative effects were sort of ignored. But if you've heard that term, laudanum, and later on a mixture called paregoric, these are opium mixtures. So morphine itself was actually isolated in 1806. So that's the first step to synthesizing a drug, and the first step in the development of the opioids was first recognizing that morphine was a single molecule component of opium, and that it could be isolated. And of course, once morphine was isolated, like all the other examples of drug isolation we've seen, now you can really concentrate not just the drug, but also the effects. And so you can get more positive effects from a smaller amount, but you're also at a higher risk for those negative effects, up to and including death by overdose if too much is taken. The naturally occurring versions, it's very hard to overdose on because they tend not to be that concentrated. And this is true not just for opioids, but for a number of products we've already seen. Codeine, which is the other opiate of interest, was isolated a little bit later, but still in the early 1800s. And of course, we've already talked about this way back in our second lecture in the entire course. There were the Opium Wars. So opium as a economic force really came to light in the mid-1800s. And of course, this was where Britain wanted Chinese goods, things like porcelain, silk, but didn't really have anything the Chinese wanted, and so they started smuggling in opium, and many inhabitants of China became dependent on it, or at least used it recreationally, and so it became this demand, and so they started trading opium for these other goods that China had. Of course, the government in China wasn't too happy about that, and so they cracked down on opium smuggling, and Britain went to war over it because they wanted that product still to be used as a revenue stream. And so that's the economic power of drugs and of opium in particular. And we'll talk about the economic power of opium in the modern era in a couple of slides. So first, what is an opium? So we've already talked about this in the opiates. So there's morphine is one of the components of opium, and then codeine is the other. We see these molecules here. Now these are complex molecules, multi-ring structure. In fact, they're three-dimensional, which is why these diagrams are a little hard to interpret. There's also thebaine, which I mentioned, and is actually a little bit unusual. It's structurally similar to morphine and codeine, but it acts as a stimulant. So thebaine is not commonly used, certainly not for the same uses that the other opiates are. But thebaine is sometimes used as a precursor to the synthetic opioids. So by modifying thebaine, it stops being a stimulant and starts acting in a more classically opioid-style fashion. So for opium itself, opium is about 10% morphine, which is fairly concentrated. That's a fairly high amount. But again, in the early 1800s, morphine is actually isolated chemically. So now 100% morphine could be synthesized and sold. Opium has a smaller amount of codeine, but still, in the couple percent range. And then there are trace amounts of other opioids, like hydrocodone and hydromorphone, that we'll talk about later. But they're trace amounts, so they're not typically considered opiates. They do occur naturally in the opium poppy, and in opium depends on when its life cycle the poppy is harvested. But there's not much in there, so it's not used as a source of hydrocodone or hydromorphone. And the thing is that morphine itself, despite its complex chemical structure, can be synthesized. But interestingly, it's not economical. It's way easier to grow fields of opium poppies and then harvest them the traditional way, which of course is a little unusual, to let nature take so big a role in the production of these drugs. So many of the drugs that are popularly used today can come from a natural source, but are often synthesized. Now there are some exceptions. But morphine is nowhere near economical enough for it to make sense to synthesize, even though synthesizing it is something within our capacity. Opium also contains, as I mentioned before, other alkaloid compounds, but they're not psychoactive, so we don't really worry about them, and they're not classified as opiates. The opiates, again, are the naturally occurring psychoactive compounds. Okay, so where is opium produced? How is it produced? We've already gone into how it's harvested. So it's grown in large fields of opium poppies, and the opium poppy can be harvested only within a fairly small window. So in a matter of a few days. But still, obviously, it's in high demand, so it is economically feasible to grow opium poppies and to harvest opium. The biggest producers of opium are Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, where it was originated, and in Mexico as well, a little bit in Colombia too. But these are traditionally the big producers. Actually, so within the realm of the Middle East, in the early 1970s, Turkey was actually a large producer of opium, and most of the opium that was and the opioids, particularly heroin, that came into the United States, especially illegally, was originally from Turkish opium poppies. This was usually shuttled through France, and this was what was known as the French Connection, um, which, of course, is also a movie from the early 70s starring Gene Hackman. If you haven't seen it, it's a very good movie, but it is about Gene Hackman's character, who is a policeman trying to crack down on drug importation and on heroin. And so the French Connection refers to the trade route, how describing how Turkey got its opium into the United States. But eventually the Turkish government cracked down on opium production, and in the later 1970s, Mexico really came into the light in terms of being a major player in opium production, and this led to what's known as black tar heroin. The black tar refers not to the heroin content itself, but the other compounds that are still in there as a result of that particular method of heroin production. But Mexican heroin became a large part of the heroin market in the U.S. in the late 1970s. And then after that, going into the 80s, Southeast Asia became prominent, and Afghanistan became prominent. And now, moving into the 2000s, Afghanistan actually makes up over 90% of opium production. This started really with the onset of the war in Afghanistan. Obviously, the government was destabilized, had other things to worry about, and so growing opium became a really major component of the Afghan economy, and continues to be. Uh, and so that's one of the dilemmas. Again, moving in, looking at drugs as a political and economic force. If you want to bolster the government of Afghanistan, how can you take away its drug producing component and still give it a solid economy? Because the economy is so shorn up by the production and sale of opium. It's a difficult question. Um, in any event, Afghanistan produces 90% of the world's opium. And then we get into the opioids. So obviously we're just talking about the modern era. Opioids have been around for quite a while, uh, but the most famous of the opioids, the non-opiate compounds, is diacetylmorphine, which was first synthesized in the late 1800s. So we have the early 1800s where we have the opiates being isolated, and then as chemistry evolves, late 1800s we see synthesis, so a new compound. And this was marketed by the Bayer Company as heroin. We remember way back when, from our first couple lectures, heroin is actually a brand name. It's used colloquially now, sort of like aspirin is, but both of those were originally brand names for drugs, also both the Bayer Company. And the thing about heroin is that it easily crosses the blood-brain barrier. It makes it so fast-acting and so effective. Morphine has a harder time crossing that blood-brain barrier. But actually, once it crosses that barrier, heroin is converted back into morphine. So it has exactly the same effects as morphine does. It's just more effective and more potent because it has an easier time crossing that barrier. And as the name suggests, it's because of the addition of two acetyl groups. So the chemistry of heroin is a little bit different than morphine, so it has an easier time crossing that barrier. There are other modified opiates. So for example, hydromorphone, which is marketed as Dilaudid, and this is another pain-killing agent, available usually through prescription, but it's also a drug of abuse. And of course, oxycodone. which is marketed and perhaps more famous, marketed as OxyContin, another popularly abused opioid. And as we'll see next time, uh, opioid abuse comes in a couple of forms. One of the most common is, of course, IV intravenous use of heroin. Um, Earlier in the history of opioids, morphine was commonly injected and used recreationally. But of course, prescription opioids are also abused, especially once people become dependent on them. And we'll talk about dependence next time. In addition to the modified opiates, there are also opioids that are fully synthetic. For example, fentanyl, which is about 100 times as potent as morphine and is used generally as an anesthetic. And methadone, which was a possible topic for your second paper. Many of you wrote about methadone. It's a very interesting issue. Methadone is slower acting um, and is thought to be less prone in terms of dependence, but you can still become dependent on methadone. So in many opinions, you're effectively just switching out one opioid for another. But again, the effects are thought to be less severe for methadone, and so it is used as a treatment for dependence. Uh, and so we'll talk more about that next time. So in next lecture, we'll keep looking at the opioids. We'll talk about the mechanism of action, that is, how the opioids affect the brain. We know that they obviously affect pain. That's the main reason for their use. As we'll see, traditionally, there have been other uses as well. What effects do opioids have? Again, in addition to analgesia, and as a function of how much is being used, and acute versus chronic effects. We'll look at all these things. And then we'll talk about some trends in use and regulation of opioids. And of course, the opiates were a big driver in early regulation. So the early 1900s, cocaine, but also the opioids and the opiates in particular, were driving changes in legislation. So we'll talk about that as well.